What happens when a city at the height of its glory, wealth, and power suddenly tears itself apart from within? And how does the greatest democracy of the ancient world collapse, not from invasion, but from its own brilliance and pride? This is the story of Athens and the war that defined an era. The Peloponnesian War wasn't just a clash between armies. It was a 27-year struggle of ideology, revenge, and survival that would forever change the course of Western civilization. It began with confidence. Athens, shining in marble and intellect under Pericles, seemed untouchable. But arrogance is a fragile crown. Within a single generation, plague, betrayal, and internal chaos would devour the empire that had once inspired the world. Imagine standing on the Acropolis, hearing the distant drums of Sparta approaching, knowing your walls will hold, but your people are dying inside. This was no ordinary war. It was the slow, brutal unraveling of everything Athens believed itself to be, and tonight, you'll relive that fall from Pericles' vision of greatness. To the city's final, tragic silence, now let's step into Chapter 1, The Rise Before the Fall. Chapter 1. The Rise Before the Fall. Have you ever watched a civilization standing at its peak so brilliant, so confident that you could almost feel the pride glowing off its marble walls? And have you ever wondered how quickly that light can turn into fire? The year is 431 BCE. The city of Athens gleams like no other in the Greek world. White columns pierce the blue sky, marketplaces overflow with trade from every sea, and poets, philosophers, and generals walk the same streets, their words echoing through eternity. This is the beating heart of democracy, the empire of the mind. And at its helm stands one man, Pericles. He is tall, composed, and radiates control. His voice alone can silence an assembly of thousands. To his followers, Pericles is more than a leader. He's the very embodiment of Athenian destiny. Under him, Athens has transformed from a city-state to an empire. Its navy dominates the Aegean, its walls stretch unbroken from the city to the port of Piraeus, and its treasury swollen with the tributes of Elysphon's temples, sculptures, and theaters. The Parthenon itself rises like a promise to the gods. And yet, beneath the marble and gold, there's a tension unseen but growing. Because Athens' brilliance isn't just admired. It's feared. Across the landlocked plains of the Peloponnese, the Spartans watch in silence. Their warriors train daily, their cities plain and disciplined. Where Athens builds art, Sparta breeds endurance. Where Athens celebrates democracy, Sparta trusts only its kings and soldiers. Between them stretches not just a line of mountains, but a gulf of belief. One sees freedom in debate, the other in obedience. For years, their rivalry simmered under a fragile peace, held together by exhaustion after the Persian Wars, but power rarely stays balanced for long. Athens' empire, disguised as an alliance, has grown greedy. The Delian League, once a coalition of equals, now pays tribute to Athens like subjects to a king. When smaller city-states complain, Athenian triremes appear on the horizon, a reminder that ideals end where empire begins. In Sparta's halls, murmurs grow louder. They say Athens has become arrogant, that Pericles seeks to rule all Greece. In Athens, voices of pride echo back. We are the light of Hellas, who can challenge us? And thus begins the long descent, the war of pride, principle, and paranoia. But before the first spear is thrown, Pericles himself stands before the Athenian assembly. The sea wind whips his cloak as he faces thousands of citizens. We must hold firm, he declares. If war comes, our walls will protect us. Our navy will feed us. Our allies will stand with us. And our greatness, our very spirit, will endure. The crowd erupts in cheers. Yet somewhere in that sea of faces, a quiet doubt flickers. Because war with Sparta isn't like any war Athens has fought before. Sparta's army is unmatched. Its warriors live only to fight and die with honor. The Spartans don't build, they destroy. And soon they'll march toward Attica, toward the shining city itself. Still, Pericles is sure of his plan. Let them come, he says. We will not fight them on land. We will shelter behind our walls, supply ourselves by sea, and wait until they tire. To his mind, its brilliance avoid the enemy's strength, strike where they are weak. To his critics, it's cowardice. Will we hide while they burn our fields? They whisper. But Pericles stands firm. Athens is not its fields. Athens is its people. The first campaign season arrives. Spartan armies flood across the border, burning crops and villages, destroying everything in sight. The Athenians, as ordered, retreat behind their long walls, watching their lands turn to smoke. Farmers become refugees, packed shoulder to shoulder in the city. The air fills with tension and something worse, disease. At first it's a cough, then fever, then madness. Within weeks, the crowded streets become a nightmare. Bodies pile in temples. Families abandon their dead. No one knows where it began, some say, from ships arriving with grain. Others call it divine punishment. Even the priests can't explain it. Only one thing is certain. The plague devours Athens faster than Sparta ever could. Pericles walks through the city he built, now filled with death. He visits the sick, refuses to flee, and for a time the people still trust him. But the gods seem silent. Soon anger replaces faith. You promised safety behind the walls. They cry, you promised victory. His strategy, so rational on paper, has turned the city into a tomb. And then fate strikes again. Pericles' own sons fall ill. His wife, too. The man who led Athens to greatness now watches his world crumble, personally, politically. Thucydides, the historian who will one day record this war, will call it a catastrophe beyond all reckoning. But in the moment, it's raw and human. You can imagine Pericles, once so composed, standing before the assembly, his voice breaking as he pleads for unity. Do not abandon our city, he says. Do not let despair destroy what courage built. Some still believe him. Others turn away. And in that silence, the democracy he cherished begins to rot from within. Outside the walls, the Spartans wait. They hear rumors of the plague and retreat, terrified it might spread to them. For a moment, Athens breathes. But inside, chaos rules. Discipline collapses. Laws mean nothing. Men steal, kill, and desecrate temples. When faith in the gods dies, so too does fear of consequence. And then, after 2 long years, the inevitable happens. Pericles himself falls sick. The man who dreamed of eternal glory gasps for air as fever ravages him. His last words, Thucydides tells us, were not of conquest, but of mercy. No one ever wore mourning clothes because of me. It's a quiet confession from a man who led with reason but could not foresee ruin. When he dies, the city mourns and divides. Without Pericles, Athens has lost its compass. The assembly splits between hawks and pragmatists, demagogues and idealists. Each claims to know what he would have wanted. None can fill his place. Yet even now, Athens refuses to yield. The war grinds on. The plague fades, but the scars remain. The city rebuilds its strength, its navy strikes at Sparta's allies, and for a moment it seems the tide might turn again. But Sparta has allies too. Deep within its ranks, a new strategist is rising, one who sees not just with a warrior's eyes, but with patience and cunning. His name is Brasidas, and he will soon change everything. While Athens dreams of glory, Brasidas will fight for survival. And in his campaign lies the first great twist of the war, the moment Athens begins to lose what no army can reclaim: belief. For now, though, imagine the city at dusk. The plague is over, the funeral pyres burn low, and the Parthenon still gleams against the blood-red sky. The Athenians gather again in the assembly, eager to avenge what they've lost. We will rise, they say. We will reclaim our destiny. But destiny has other plans. In the distance, ships are gathering Spartan and Persian gold, beginning to intertwine. The gods, it seems, are not done with Greece. And as the chapter closes, the wind over Athens carries a warning. Whispered through the columns, the empire that survives the plague will not survive itself. The next chapter, The Empire of Shadows, will reveal how the dream of Athens turns into obsession, and how the war that began for honor begins to devour everything sacred. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2, The Empire of Shadows, next? Chapter 2, The empire of shadows, what happens when a city built on freedom begins to fear its own voice? When the brilliance that once inspired the world becomes a mask for its hunger for control? The Athens that rises after the plague is not the same city that Pericles built. It is wounded, angry, and desperate to prove that it still matters. The smoke of the funeral pyres has barely faded when the assembly reconvenes. The voices are louder now, harsher, more emotional. The plague has stripped away restraint. Men who once spoke with reason now shout for revenge. "We have suffered enough," one cries. "It is time Sparta pays." The crowd roars. Grief turns to rage. Democracy turns to theater. Among the new leaders stands Cleon, a man of fire and fury, not philosophy. Where Pericles reasoned, Cleon commands. He knows how to rouse the mob, how to promise victory in words that drip with passion. "Our enemies think we are broken," he says, "but we will show them the strength of the Athenian heart." The people cheer, needing to believe. They've lost their families, their homes, their faith. All that remains is vengeance. And so, Athens goes to war again, not with strategy, but with pride. Cleon sends fleets to raid Spartan coasts, seizing villages and burning farmlands. For the first time, Sparta feels the sting of humiliation. The proud hoplites, undefeated on land, are forced to defend their own soil. But Athens' triumph is brief. Because while Cleon celebrates, Sparta begins to adapt. And in the north, a man named Brasidas, clever, disciplined, almost poetic in his restraint, emerges as the unlikeliest of Spartan heroes. Unlike his peers, he does not fight to destroy, he fights to persuade. His weapon is not the spear, but diplomacy wrapped in steel. Brasidas marched north into Thrace, far from the main battlefield, aiming for the cities that supply Athens' empire with silver and grain. When he arrives at Amphipolis, a crucial Athenian colony, he doesn't storm the walls. Instead, he calls to the people. "Athens uses you," he says. "It taxes your labor and calls it alliance. I come not as conqueror, but as liberator." The words strike home. The gates open. For the first time in the war, an Athenian city welcomes a Spartan army. The news hits Athens like thunder. Cleon rages, the assembly panics, and suddenly the war no longer feels distant. The empire is bleeding from within. Athens sends reinforcements, desperate to reclaim Amphipolis, and fate sets the stage for one of the most tragic encounters in Greek history. Two men, Cleon the demagogue and Brasidas the idealist, will meet on the battlefield. Neither knows that both are walking toward their deaths. The morning of the battle is cold and misty. The Athenian army waits outside Amphipolis' walls, tense and uncertain. Cleon, who had built his power through words, now faces the one thing he cannot control: reality. Across the plain, Brasidas prepares his men in silence. He knows the risk. His army is smaller, his position exposed, but he trusts in speed and surprise. At noon, Brasidas gives the signal. His soldiers burst from the city gates, shields gleaming, the sound of their charge echoing through the valley. Cleon, startled, hesitates. His line falters. He tries to retreat, but panic spreads faster than command. In the chaos, Brasidas strikes him down. The demagogue who once ruled Athens with his tongue dies, running from the very courage he demanded of others. But Brasidas, too, is struck by a spear. As he falls, his men carry him into Amphipolis, where he learns of his victory before breathing his last. Two leaders, two visions, both gone in the same hour. Their deaths mark a pause in the madness. With both sides exhausted, Athens and Sparta finally agree to peace. It will be known as the Peace of Nicias, named after the cautious Athenian who negotiates it. For a brief moment, the world breathes again. Farmers return to their fields, ships sail without fear, and the gods seem to smile once more. But peace, in the hands of men who remember blood, is a fragile illusion. Even as the ink dries, whispers spread. Some in Athens call Nicias a coward, accusing him of betraying glory for comfort. Others in Sparta fume that their allies were not consulted. In secret, both sides prepare for what they know will come again. And in Athens, the seeds of the next disaster begin to sprout in the mind of a young man, brilliant, charming, reckless Alcibiades. He is everything Pericles was not, beautiful where Pericles was austere, daring where he was patient, ambitious beyond measure. He was once Pericles' ward, raised among philosophers, taught by Socrates himself. But where Socrates sought truth, Alcibiades seeks fame. He walks through the agora with a lion cub on a leash, attends symposiums drunk on power as much as wine, and speaks with a charisma that can bend crowds like the wind bends fire. Why settle for peace? He asks. Athens was born to lead. The world belongs to those who dare. And the people, weary of caution, begin to listen. Alcibiades' words ignite something in the Athenian heart that never truly died, the hunger for conquest. He promises them new wealth, new allies, new glory. His dream is bold, almost insane, an expedition to Sicily. If Athens can conquer the great island and its rich city of Syracuse, it will control the western seas. The assembly hesitates until Alcibiades speaks. If we win, he says, Athens will rule the world. And with that, the vote passes. The largest expedition Athens has ever assembled, over 200 ships and thousands of men sets sail across the Mediterranean. As they depart, the city cheers. Drums beat, sails snap, and the sun glints off the bronze helmets like fire. It is a scene of triumph. But beneath the roar of celebration, the gods are silent. Because even before the fleet leaves harbor, omens turn dark. In the night, sacred statues of Hermes are defaced, noses broken, faces mutilated. Panic spreads. The Athenians see it as a sign of doom. And suspicion falls, of course, on Alcibiades. His enemies seize the moment, accusing him of sacrilege, of mocking the gods in secret rituals. The fleet is already at sea when the order comes from Athens. Alcibiades is to return home and stand trial. But he never does. Instead, Alcibiades deserts. He slips away from the Athenian fleet, sails east, and arrives, of all places, in Sparta. It is the ultimate betrayal. The man who once led Athens' greatest army now offers his brilliance to its greatest enemy. And the Spartans, wary but intrigued, listen. Alcibiades tells them everything Athens plans, its weaknesses, even how to defeat its fleet. He advises them to fortify a base in Attica itself, at a place called Decelea, and to ally with Persia for gold to rebuild their navy. The Spartans follow his advice to the letter. Soon, Athenian grain ships are cut off, silver mines lost, and the city's walls, once its strength, become a prison again. Meanwhile, in Sicily, disaster unfolds. The Athenian army, now leaderless and confused, finds itself trapped in a foreign land. Syracuse, guided by a Spartan general sent on Alcibiades' suggestion, fights back fiercely. The Athenian fleet is cornered in the harbor. Their ships, too large to maneuver, crash into one another as flaming arrows rain from the walls. In the chaos, men leap into the water, only to be cut down or dragged ashore in chains. When the news reaches Athens, it is unbearable. An entire generation gone. The empire's pride sunk beneath Sicilian waves. Families wander the streets in mourning, and for the first time the city feels truly cursed. And yet, amid the despair, the assembly gathers once more. They cannot surrender. To do so would mean the end. They build new ships from stripped wood, melt temple offerings into coins, and summon whatever strength remains. The Athenian spirit, broken but not extinguished, burns with defiance. But Sparta now holds the advantage. With Persian gold and Athenian betrayal, it builds a fleet to rival even the once invincible triremes of the Delian League. For the first time in the war, the sea, the lifeblood of Athens, is no longer safe. And as Spartan sails rise on the horizon, one truth becomes clear: the empire of Athens is now an empire of shadows, fighting ghosts of its former glory, haunted by its own ambition. Somewhere in exile, Alcibiades watches the war he began, consuming both sides. His charm, his wit, his daring, once weapons of persuasion, are now his curse. Every city he touches turns to ruin. Yet fate isn't done with him. Soon he will return again, switching sides like a fox between fires, his loyalties as fluid as the sea itself. But that is the next twist in the story, the return of the exile, and the beginning of the final act of the Peloponnesian War. For now, Athens stands at twilight. Its temples are still grand, its navy still sails, but its soul trembles. The same democracy that once gave the world reason now teeters between tyranny and chaos. And as night falls over the Acropolis, the wind whispers the same question it did years ago when the plague first struck. Can a city that defies the gods survive its own genius? The answer waits in Chapter 3, The Exile and the Empire's Endgame. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 3, The Exile and the Empire's Endgame, next? Chapter 3, The Exile and the Empire's Endgame. Have you ever seen a man who could change the course of nations with a single conversation? A man whose brilliance made him indispensable, but whose ambition made him dangerous to everyone who trusted him. That man was Alcibiades, and his return would ignite the final, unpredictable phase of the Peloponnesian War. By the time Athens receives the crushing news from Sicily, the annihilation of its army, the capture of its generals, the drowning of its sailors, the city is paralyzed with shock. It isn't just defeat, it's disbelief. An empire that once ruled the Aegean has lost nearly everything in one reckless gamble. The port of Piraeus, once alive with trade and laughter, now echoes with silence. The marble gleam of the Parthenon feels cold, almost mocking, under the Athenian sun. Sparta wastes no time. At Alcibiades' urging, they fortified Decelea in the hills above Athens, cutting the city off from its silver mines and food routes. Day and night, Spartan patrols stand visible from the city walls, a constant reminder that even behind their fortifications, the Athenians are not safe. Grain prices soar. Famine creeps in. A democracy that once prided itself on debate now trembles under fear. But fate, capricious as ever, refuses to let the story end here. For Alcibiades, the man who betrayed Athens, soon finds that betrayal is a currency that never holds its value. In Sparta, his charm begins to wear thin. His relationship with the Spartan king's wife whispered in alleys and joked about in barracks turns rumor into outrage. The austere warriors who prize discipline above all begin to see the Athenian exile for what he truly is, brilliant, yes, but dangerous. When word reaches Alcibiades that the Spartan authorities plan to execute him, he vanishes. One night his tent is empty. The next morning he's gone, another ghost in the shifting fog of war. And where does he reappear? Not in Athens, not in Sparta, but in the one place both sides have courted and feared for years, Persia. There, in the lavish courts of Tissaphanes, satrap of the great king, Alcibiades begins weaving a new web. He convinces the Persian that neither Athens nor Sparta should be allowed to dominate. Keep them balanced, he advises, so they destroy each other. The satrap listens, amused by the Athenians' audacity. Alcibiades has no army, no city, no loyalty, but his mind remains his empire. Meanwhile, in the desperate chambers of Athens, the mood is darkening. The democracy is fracturing again, this time more violently than ever before. The oligarchs' wealthy men who have always despised the mob rule of the assembly see an opportunity. Democracy brought us ruin, they argue. Let the wise few save what remains. In the year 411 BCE, amid hunger and fear, they stage a coup. Athens, birthplace of democracy, becomes ruled by 400 men. They promise stability, they promise reform, but behind closed doors, they plot for peace with Sparta at any price. The streets whisper with betrayal. Soldiers at Samos, the last major Athenian fleet still loyal to democracy, refuse to recognize the new regime. Civil war looms within the larger war. And here, like a ghost from another life, Alcibiades returns once more. The fleet at Samos, cut off from the city, doesn't know whom to trust. Then a messenger arrives. Alcibiades wishes to speak. The officers are divided. Some want him dead, others want his counsel, but curiosity wins. When he appears, sunburned and sharp-eyed, his presence alone disarms them. I have been your enemy, he says, but I can be your salvation. Persia listens to me. Together we can turn the tide? It sounds absurd, but the sailors, desperate for hope, believe him. They elect him commander, reinstating the man once condemned for treason. And under his guidance, something miraculous happens. Athens begins to win again. At the naval battles of Abydos and Cyzicus, the Athenian fleet, now rejuvenated under Alcibiades' cunning, destroys the Spartan squadrons. The sea, long lost, feels Athenian once more. Cities begin to reopen their gates. Tribute starts to flow again. For a fleeting moment, it feels like the empire might rise from its ashes. Back in Athens, word spreads. Alcibiades has returned. Alcibiades has saved us. The oligarchs fall, the democracy is restored, and the city starved and scarred finds its voice again. When Alcibiades finally sails home, the reception is nothing short of divine. Crowds pour onto the docks, throwing garlands, shouting his name. The exile has become a hero. But if history teaches anything, it is that Athens never loves anyone for long. Alcibiades knows his triumph is fragile. He restores the festivals, donates to temples, and leads processions to thank the gods he once offended. But beneath the celebration, envy simmers. Old rivals whisper, he serves himself, not Athens. Still, for a brief, brilliant window, he commands the city's fate once more. And then disaster again. While Alcibiades is away on campaign, his subordinate makes a reckless move, engaging the Spartans without orders. The Athenian fleet is caught off guard and annihilated at Notium. When the news reaches Athens, the mob's mood turns in an instant. Alcibiades was negligent. They cry. He trusted the wrong man. Ingrateful and impulsive as ever, the assembly votes to strip him of command. Fearing another trial or worse, Alcibiades flees into exile once more, vanishing into obscurity. And with him goes Athens' last flicker of genius. The final act begins. Sparta, guided now by the cunning Lysander and backed by Persian gold, builds a new navy sleek, fast, and merciless. Athens, weakened by years of war, struggles to keep its ships afloat. Yet, even in ruin, the city fights on. Its sailors, once the masters of the Aegean, row until their hands bleed. Its citizens melt temple treasures into coins to pay for one more campaign. Hope lingers, not rational hope, but the kind born from sheer defiance. The turning point comes at Aegospotami in 405 BCE on a quiet shore near the Hellespont. The Athenian fleet lies anchored, tired, and careless after days of waiting. Across the water, Lysander's ships sit motionless. He does not attack. He waits. Each morning, the Athenians row out, challenge him, and return, convinced the Spartans fear them. Each evening, they wander inland for food. Then, one morning, the trap springs. When the Athenian sailors are scattered on the beach, Lysander strikes. His fleet sweeps across the water in silence, catching the enemy unprepared. In moments, the Athenian ships burn. Those who flee are hunted down. Those who surrender are executed. Out of nearly 200 triremes, only a handful escape, one carrying the dreadful news back to Athens. When it arrives, the city knows it is finished. The grain routes are gone. The navy, Athens' pride, its heart, its empire is dust. Yet the Athenians refuse to open their gates. Better to die free, they say, than live as slaves. Sparta tightens its grip. For months the siege drags on. The people eat anything, dogs, roots, even leather. The Parthenon looms over a city dying beneath its shadow. Mothers hush their children with empty promises of bread. In the assembly, silence reigns. No more speeches, no more dreams. Then one dawn, the food is gone. The ships do not come. And the long walls, once a symbol of strength, become a prison without air. On a cold spring morning in 404 BCE, Athens surrenders. The Spartans enter the city without celebration. Lysander orders the walls torn down to the sound of flutes. Brick by brick, the pride of Athens collapses. The empire of the sea is now an empire no more. But perhaps the cruelest blow is yet to come. In the aftermath, Sparta installs a puppet government, the 30 tyrants. Men who had once called themselves Athenians now turn on their own people, purging, exiling, executing. Among them is Critias, once a student of Socrates. The philosopher himself, now old, watches as the city that invented free thought strangles its own soul. He warns them gently, no man willingly chooses evil. But Athens, blind from suffering, no longer listens. And what of Alcibiades? Far away in Phrygia, he lives in uneasy exile, forever hunted, forever restless. He dreams of returning, of one final gamble to restore his name. But history has no patience for dreamers who outlive their age. One night, his house is surrounded by assassins, perhaps Spartan agents, perhaps Persian. He runs into the moonlight, naked, armed with a dagger, and dies as he lived, defiant, unbowed, and utterly alone. The man who once held the destiny of Athens in his hands now becomes another forgotten body on a foreign road. Yet his ghost lingers. In every debate, in every ambition, in every whisper of empire, the spirit of Alcibiades lives on, a reminder of how brilliance without restraint can burn the brightest city to ash. And still, even in ruin, Athens does not vanish. The tyranny collapses within a year. The democracy, battered but alive, returns. The people rebuild their homes, their temples, their schools, but they never regain the empire. They never again believe themselves invincible. For in the silence after the war, Greece itself has changed. Sparta's victory brings no peace-only exhaustion. The gods seem distant now, the heroes dead, the golden age gone. But from the rubble, another light begins to flicker. Young thinkers Plato, Xenophon, and others who watch the fall begin to ask new questions. What is justice? What is power? What truly is freedom? And so the Peloponnesian War ends not with triumph, but with awakening. The empire falls, but its memory endures. The lessons of pride, ambition, and hubris will echo far beyond Greece into Rome, into Europe, into every age that forgets that greatness, unchecked, always devours itself. Chapter 4. The Fall That Echoed Through the Ages. Have you ever wondered what happens after a civilization collapses? When the drums of war fall silent, and the heroes are gone, what remains of the people who once believed themselves immortal? Athens had surrendered, its empire dissolved, its navy broken, its pride scattered like dust. Yet the story of the Peloponnesian War did not end in silence. It reverberated through minds, through memories, through centuries, shaping everything that came after. When the Spartans tore down the long walls to the sound of flutes, it was meant to symbolize freedom, the liberation of Greece from Athenian tyranny. But in truth, it felt like a funeral. The sound of the flutes drifted over the ruins, over empty markets and shuttered temples, and even the victors looked uneasy. For 27 years, Greece had been devouring itself. The gods had chosen no side. Every city had lost sons, treasure, and faith. Victory tasted like ashes. The 30 tyrants installed by Sparta to restore order wasted no time revealing their true nature. Led by Critias, a man once celebrated for his intellect and poetry, the 30 ruled with iron and terror. The streets of Athens filled with fear again, not from plague, but from betrayal. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Property was confiscated, families exiled. Those who once cheered democracy now hid in their homes, afraid to speak a word out of turn. And through it all, Socrates old, calm, unshaken, walked the same streets he always had, questioning everyone he met. To some he was a madman, to others a prophet. He had warned that Athens' sickness was not political but moral, that its obsession with wealth and victory had poisoned its soul. Now, as his students joined the new regime or fled from it, his quiet defiance became a symbol of something deeper, the endurance of thought in a world broken by power. But tyrannies, like wars, burn out faster than they imagine. Within a year, the 30 were overthrown by an army of exiles led by a man Thrasybulus. It was a civil war in miniature, a brief but brutal reckoning between Athenians themselves. When the smoke cleared, democracy returned bloodied but alive. And in a rare moment of grace, the new government issued a general amnesty. The people, weary of vengeance, swore to forget the past. Let no one recall the wrongs of the war, they declared. For a time, it worked. The city began to breathe again. The markets reopened. Plays returned to the theaters. The young listened to philosophers as they had before the war, dreaming of something beyond survival. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. The age of idealism, the age of faith in democracy's perfection, was over. What remained was realism, skepticism, and a longing for certainty that no assembly vote could provide. That longing would define the next generation. Socrates continued teaching, drawing students who would shape the world. Among them was Plato, who had watched his cities collapse as a young man. To him, democracy had become a mob easily swayed by emotion, blind to wisdom, quick to destroy its own heroes. He would later write, "Democracy passes into despotism, and in that single phrase lay the grief of an entire era." But before his ideas could take shape, Athens would commit one final act of tragedy. In 399 BCE, just 5 years after the war's end, Socrates was put on trial. The charges were vague, corrupting the youth, impiety toward the gods, but everyone knew what they really meant. He was the conscience Athens could no longer bear to face. The man who asked uncomfortable questions about virtue and justice now stood before the very system that claimed to embody them. The trial lasted days. Friends begged him to recant, to flee, to compromise. But Socrates refused. "The unexamined life is not worth living," he said quietly, knowing the words would outlive him. The jury voted to condemn him to death. When he drank the hemlock, surrounded by his students, a strange calm filled the room. Athens had killed the one man who still believed it could be better. And yet, in doing so, it ensured that his ideas would never die. His death became the seed of a philosophy that would define the Western world, a philosophy born not of conquest, but of loss. Meanwhile, outside Athens, the rest of Greece was unraveling. Sparta, now supreme, discovered that ruling an empire was far harder than destroying one. Its rigid system built for war, not governance, crumbled under the weight of victory. The allies that once cheered its triumph began to resent its dominance. The Persian gold that had funded its navy now came with demands. Within a generation, Sparta itself faced rebellion from Thebes, from Corinth, from within. The same pattern repeated: arrogance, conflict, decline. No city could escape it. The gods, it seemed, punished hubris no matter the banner it wore. And yet, amid the ruins, a strange transformation was taking place. Greece, for all its exhaustion, was turning inward. With its armies depleted, its people began to turn from the battlefield to the mind. The decades after the Peloponnesian War saw an explosion of thought philosophy, science, art, and history, all reflections on what had gone wrong. Thucydides, once a general exiled during the war, completed his great work, The History of the Peloponnesian War. He wrote not to glorify heroes, but to expose human nature itself, the greed, fear, and ambition that drive nations to destroy themselves. "The strong do what they can," he wrote, "and the weak suffer what they must." It was not cynicism, but clarity, the kind only someone who had seen civilization rot from within could possess. His words would echo long after Greece fell silent. For as Athens and Sparta decayed, a new power was quietly stirring to the north, a kingdom the southern Greeks dismissed as barbarian. Macedonia, its kings watched, learned, and waited. Among them was a young prince with restless eyes and a mind like fire. His name was Alexander. He grew up listening to the tales of Athens' glory and fall, of Pericles' speeches and Alcibiades' betrayals. He studied under Aristotle, who taught him of Socrates and Plato, of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the seductions of power. But where the philosophers saw warning, Alexander saw challenge. "If the Greeks could not unite," he thought, "I will do what they could not." The lesson of the Peloponnesian War became his obsession. That division invites ruin, and that destiny favors the bold. When he finally marched east, his army carried more than swords. They carried the memory of every mistake their ancestors had made. Alexander would conquer the world that had broken Athens and Sparta, fusing their brilliance and brutality into a single vision. But even he, for all his genius, could not escape the shadow of the war that taught Greece how fragile greatness truly is. His empire, like theirs, would not last. It would blaze, then fracture, and the cycle would begin anew. Back in Athens centuries later, the Parthenon still stood. Weathered, looted, scarred, but standing. Travelers from Rome, from Egypt, from lands beyond the horizon would come and stare at its columns, asking the same question that haunted the generations before them. How could something so beautiful, so advanced, fall so completely? Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Peloponnesian War, not the battles, not the politics, not even the philosophy it birthed, but the eternal mirror it holds to humanity. For every empire that rises believes it is different. Every leader believes his city, his nation, his moment will be the one that endures. And yet the same forces, fear, pride, greed, rivalry, always wake beneath the surface, whispering the same fate. The Athenians thought themselves chosen by the gods. The Spartans thought themselves unbreakable. Both discovered that greatness, when built on arrogance, becomes its own undoing. And still, there's something almost heroic in their failure. They fell, yes, but from their fall came everything that defines us: history, philosophy, democracy, science, tragedy, art. From ruin, meaning was born. As twilight settles over the Acropolis, you can almost imagine the ghosts of that vanished world: the orators, the soldiers, the philosophers still walking among the stones, their voices faint but enduring. Remember, they seem to say, our story is not just ours. It is yours. Every age fights its own Peloponnesian War. But even as we listen, a deeper question lingers, one that the Greeks themselves never fully answered. Can humanity ever learn from its own downfall? Or are we doomed to repeat the cycle: brilliance to arrogance, ambition to ruin, again and again? The next chapter will trace that haunting legacy, the long echo of Athens and Sparta through Rome, through empire, through the very world we live in today. For the war may have ended millennia ago, but its shadow still walks beside us. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 5, Legacy of Fire, how the Peloponnesian War shaped the world next? Chapter 5, Legacy of Fire, how the Peloponnesian War shaped the world. What if the end of one empire was never really an ending but a spark? What if the fall of Athens didn't just close a chapter of Greek history, but quietly rewrote the story of civilization itself? The ruins of the Peloponnesian War did not fade into silence. They became lessons whispered across generations, lessons that would shape kings, philosophers, empires, and even the world we live in now. When the dust of Athens finally settled and Sparta's glory began to rust, Greece stood stunned, broken, yet alive. The landscape that had once echoed with the tramp of hoplites now lay quiet, but not peaceful. In the ashes, ideas were still burning. The men and women who survived the war had seen what power could do when unrestrained, how democracy could devour itself, and how brilliance without balance led only to ruin. They carried those scars like truths etched into the soul of a civilization. It began, as so many rebirths do, with questions. After Socrates' death, his students scattered. Some left Athens entirely, unable to bear the sight of the city that had condemned their teacher. Others stayed, determined to rebuild not the walls, but the spirit. Among them, Plato began to write. He had been young when the war ended, old enough to remember the terror of the 30 tyrants and the bitterness that followed. To him, the real battlefield wasn't between Athens and Sparta, it was between wisdom and ignorance, between reason and desire. In his dialogues, Plato turned the lessons of war into philosophy. His Republic imagined a city that could not fall, a place ruled not by demagogues or tyrants, but by philosopher kings, men trained to see truth beyond ambition. It was his answer to Pericles' dream, his cure for Cleon's mob and Alcibiades' arrogance. But beneath the idealism was a melancholy truth. Plato's perfect city could never exist in the real world. It was a vision born from longing, not possibility, and yet that longing changed everything. From it came the Academy, the first great institution of higher learning in the Western world. There, knowledge replaced conquest, reason replaced rhetoric. The sons of men who had once died for empire now debated ethics, mathematics, and justice. It was as if the Greeks, exhausted by war, decided to conquer eternity instead of territory. But Athens was not alone in transformation. Sparta, too, discovered that victory is often more dangerous than defeat. For a few short decades, it ruled over Greece with a heavy hand, imposing oligarchies, garrisons, and fear. Yet the Spartan way of life, so rigid, so narrow, could not survive peace. Its warriors had been bred for combat, not governance. Its young men, raised to obey without question, found themselves adrift in a world that demanded thought. The iron discipline that had once made Sparta strong now strangled it. Within a century, the city that had humbled Athens became a hollow name. Its fields empty, its glory vanished, and still the ghost of their rivalry lingered. Greece, divided and proud, could never unite for long. Thebes rose next under the brilliant general Epaminondas, defeating Sparta and briefly holding the balance of power. But the pattern repeated: victory, arrogance, decline. City after city clawed for dominance, and each fell into the same trap the curse the Peloponnesian War had cast over them all, until one day the noise stopped from the northern mountains. Where few Greek eyes had ever looked with respect, came a new force Macedon. Its king, Philip II, was not a philosopher, but he was a student of Greek chaos. As a boy, he had been a hostage in Thebes. He had watched their armies drill and their leaders quarrel. When he returned home, he carried with him the one thing Greece had lost, the art of unity. Philip built a new kind of army, disciplined like the Spartans, ambitious like the Athenians, adaptable like no army before it. He forged the long spear phalanx and mixed it with cavalry brains and muscle combined. He didn't ask the Greek cities to join him. He made them. By the time of his death, all of Greece, once unthinkably divided, bowed to Macedon. But Philip's dream would not die with him. His son would inherit it and transform it into something the world had never seen. Alexander, raised on Homer's Iliad and tutored by Aristotle himself. Alexander saw in the ruins of Greece not tragedy but destiny. "My father has given me Greece," he is said to have boasted, "but I will give it the world." To him, the Peloponnesian War was not a warning, but a map, a record of what ambition could achieve. If guided by purpose instead of pride when he marched east, he carried Greece with him, not its armies, but its ideas. The soldiers who followed him built not just fortresses, but libraries and theaters. In the lands of Persia and Egypt, Greek became the language of science, art, and governance. What Pericles had once dreamed, a world enlightened by reason, was reborn through conquest. The irony was cruel and perfect, the war that had destroyed. Greece became the foundation of its greatest expansion, but even Alexander, like the cities before him, could not outrun the lessons of the past. His empire stretched too wide, his ambitions burned too bright. When he died at 32, his generals turned on one another, carving up his legacy like scavengers dividing a corpse. The Hellenistic kingdoms that followed shone briefly, then faded. And yet, through the ashes, the Greek mind endured. In Alexandria, philosophers debated the nature of the universe beneath the shadow of the world's greatest library. In Athens, Plato's students carried forward his vision, none more brilliantly than Aristotle, who taught logic as others once taught war. The Greek experiment, the search for how men should live together, did not end with their fall. It evolved centuries later when Rome rose from the Italian plains. It inherited the world Greece had imagined. Roman generals studied Thucydides' history to understand strategy and power. Roman senators quoted Pericles' speeches to justify empire. Even in their brutality, the Romans admired Athens' grace. They built marble temples in her image. Their children learned her language. Their philosophers borrowed her doubts. The Peloponnesian War, though long past, lived on as a warning whispered through marble halls that no power, however great, can escape corruption from within. Roman historians saw in it their own reflection. Ambition, cloaked as virtue, freedom turned to control. When their republic fell to dictatorship, it was Athens all over again, played on a grander stage. And as centuries passed, that story kept returning through every civilization that rose and believed itself different. In the Renaissance, artists rediscovered the beauty Athens had once created, and thinkers resurrected her questions. In the Enlightenment, philosophers turned again to the Greek model of democracy, convinced they could perfect what had once failed. Even modern republics, France, America, the nations that claim freedom as birthright, carry in their bones the double inheritance of the Peloponnesian War, the dream of liberty and the danger of pride. The echoes are everywhere. Every debate about power and morality, every struggle between idealism and realism, every empire that expands beyond its wisdom, all trace their lineage back to those decades of fire between Athens and Sparta. But perhaps the strangest legacy of all is not political or philosophical, but human. The Peloponnesian War gave the world its first true historians, not chroniclers of kings, but analysts of cause and consequence. Herodotus had written of wonders. Thucydides wrote of men. He stripped away the divine, the mythic, the comfortable lies, and looked directly at human nature. What he found was not noble, but it was true that fear, self-interest, and the thirst for power shape history more than virtue ever could. That insight, dark, unsettling, honest, became the foundation of everything we now call realism. Statesmen, generals, and thinkers from Machiavelli to Clausewitz, from Lincoln to Churchill, all carried his voice in the back of their minds. Every time a leader warns that we fight not for justice, but survival, Thucydides is speaking still, and so the Peloponnesian War never truly ended. It changed names, changed continents, changed weapons, but its essence lives on in every rivalry that divides mankind. Each generation builds its own Athens, its own Sparta, ideals versus discipline, freedom versus order, innovation versus fear. Each believes it can win without paying the same price, but history waits patiently. Perhaps that is why, even today, when you walk among the ruins of the Acropolis or the crumbling theaters of Sparta, there is a feeling that the story isn't finished. The stones remember the triumph, the plague, the betrayal. They remind us that civilization's greatest test is not how high it climbs, but how it endures when it begins to fall. And yet, even in that fall there is hope. For every Athens that burns, there rises another mind that learns. For every war that destroys, there comes a generation that questions. The Peloponnesian War did not extinguish human greatness, it forced it to evolve. From its ashes came philosophy. From its ruins came democracy reborn. From its tragedy came the understanding that progress is never permanent, and that the pursuit of truth must outlast the lust for power. So when we speak of Athens and Sparta, we are not talking about marble and myth. We are talking about us, the choices we make, the conflicts we inherit, the fragile balance between brilliance and self-destruction. The war ended over 2,000 years ago, but its question still hangs in the air, unanswered, alive. Can humanity ever wield power without being consumed by it?